They thought I was just another homeowner they could bully. They slapped me with fake fines, threatened to seize my house, and paraded their authority like kings of the cul-de-sac. What they didn't know was that behind the front door they tried to take stood a federal judge with the evidence that would destroy them all. The story of how a neighborhood dispute spiraled into a battle of authority, corruption, and justice did not begin with loud confrontations or dramatic seizures. It began quietly, almost too quietly, with a simple letter slipped into my mailbox. At first glance, it looked official, its envelope marked with the emblem of the Homeowners Association. I lived in a gated community that prided itself on manicured lawns, sparkling sidewalks, and a list of rules that seemed longer than the Constitution itself. Like most residents, I had paid my dues regularly, kept my lawn trimmed, and followed the rules as best as I could. My career as a federal judge meant I valued order, law, and structure. But I also knew how easily those in power could twist rules for their own gain. The letter claimed I was in violation of several HOA guidelines. It listed supposed offenses, a faded mailbox, cracks in the driveway, and improper landscaping. I stood there on my porch, holding the letter, and chuckled to myself. My mailbox had been repainted just last year. My driveway had only a hairline crack, nothing unusual for concrete exposed to changing weather. And as for landscaping, my hedges were trimmed with precision. I often hired professionals to maintain them. Still, I told myself it must be a clerical error. Bureaucracies often stumbled over their own paperwork. I put the letter aside, deciding to deal with it later. But days later, another notice arrived. This time harsher in tone, with bold letters warning of fines if I didn't rectify violations immediately. That was when I began to sense something was off. Subtle pressure walking through the neighborhood, I noticed small details. A neighbor, Mrs. Hernandez, whispered to me over her fence one morning. "Ove started targeting people," she said, her voice low as though someone might overhear. Someone might overhear. "They fined me $500 last month because my son left his basketball hoop in the driveway overnight. I paid it, but..." She trailed off, looking nervous. "Did you appeal?" I asked. She shook her head. They told me I could, but the board denied it before I even had the hearing. Said it was a waste of time. Another neighbor, Mr. Williams, mentioned he'd been told to replace his roof shingles at a cost of nearly $15,000, even though they were only a few years old. "Oh, they said they didn't match the approved shade of gray," he muttered bitterly. "Oh, do you know how many shades of gray there are? It's madness. But if I didn't comply, they threatened to put a lien on my home." As a judge, I had handled countless cases of overreach, from corporate misconduct to municipal bullying. But seeing it play out here, in the quiet streets where children rode bicycles and retirees watered their lawns, struck a deeper nerve. It wasn't just about rules, it was about control. The HOA President shadowed the president of the HOA. A man named Richard Coleman was known for his sharp suits and sharper tongue. He was a retired businessman, wealthy, and always quick to remind others of his dedication to the community. To the casual observer, he seemed like a civic-minded leader. But I had seen his type before in courtrooms, individuals who hid greed and manipulation behind polished speeches. I first encountered him face to face after the third notice arrived in my mailbox. This one was an intent to fine a letter demanding immediate payment of $1,200 for accumulated violations. I attended the next HOA meeting, determined to address the issue. The room was filled with about 30 residents seated in neat rows, while the board sat at a long table in front. Coleman presided in the center, his posture rigid, his smile thin. When the floor opened for comments, I raised my hand and stepped forward. "These violations listed against me are baseless," I said calmly. "My mailbox is in good condition, my driveway is structurally sound, and my landscaping follows the guidelines. I'd like to know on what grounds these fines are being imposed." Coleman leaned forward, clasping his hands. "Mr. Harrison, our inspections are thorough." "If you believe otherwise, you may file an appeal." "I already attempted to," I replied. I was informed that the appeal board is the same as the HOA board. That makes it impossible to receive an impartial review. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Coleman's jaw tightened. "Other rules are the rules," he said curtly. Perhaps you should spend less time debating and more time complying. It was meant as a jab, but I merely nodded, my mind already processing. His defensiveness confirmed my suspicion these so-called violations were not random, they were deliberate. Gathering the puzzle pieces over the following weeks, the pressure mounted. More letters arrived, each one more aggressive. Late fees were tacked on. Threats of legal action and foreclosure were hinted at. But I didn't respond in anger. I responded with observation. I began keeping meticulous records, scanning each letter, photographing my property from multiple angles, even videotaping the condition of my driveway and lawn. I spoke with neighbors, carefully noting their experiences. A pattern emerged. Residents who were outspoken, independent, or unwilling to bend to Coleman's influence were the ones being targeted. Those who complied quickly, or who were close to Coleman socially, were left alone. It was a form of selective enforcement, a common abuse of HOA power. But the scope suggested something larger. Coleman wasn't just collecting fines. He was systematically pressuring homeowners, many of them elderly or financially vulnerable, into a corner where selling their homes seemed like the only option. And who, I wondered, was buying these properties once they were abandoned under pressure? The tipping point, the final straw of this first stage, came one crisp autumn morning. I stepped onto my porch to retrieve the newspaper and found not a letter, but a bright red notice taped to my front door. In bold capital letters it read, "Final warning, property seizure imminent. According to the notice, I owed over $6,000 in unpaid fines and fees. Failure to pay would result in the HOA initiating foreclosure proceedings." I stared at the paper, my pulse steady but my mind sharp. This was no longer a minor inconvenience. It was a direct attempt to strip me of my home under the guise of neighborhood governance. But what Coleman and his allies didn't realize was that they had picked the wrong target. I was not just another homeowner, too, intimidated to fight back. I was a federal judge with years of experience unraveling schemes exactly like this one, and I already had the evidence I needed to begin dismantling theirs. Reflection that first phase, the warning signs, was more than just a battle over fines and letters. It was the unveiling of a larger war for control. Many in the neighborhood had already bowed to the pressure, writing checks they couldn't afford or selling homes they loved. I could see the manipulation for what it was. An abuse of power designed to enrich a few at the expense of many. As I folded the red notice and placed it carefully in my file, I felt no fear. Instead, I felt resolve. Coleman thought he could intimidate me into silence, but he had no idea who I was or the storm that was about to crash down upon him. The warning signs had been delivered. The game had begun. And I was prepared to see it through to the end. The red notice taped to my door was more than paper and ink. It was a declaration of war. Up until that point, Coleman and his HOA board had been content to operate in the shadows of bureaucracy, hiding behind polite letters and administrative warnings. But the moment they threatened to seize my home, the game changed, and I was not a man who folded under pressure. The HOA meeting, the next HOA meeting, was scheduled for Thursday evening inside the community clubhouse. Normally, these gatherings drew a sparse crowd of a dozen or so residents, but this time, word had spread about the sudden wave of fines and foreclosure threats. The room was packed, nearly every seat taken, with people standing along the walls. The air was thick with unease. Coleman sat at the center of the board's long table, flanked by 4 members who looked more like obedient soldiers than independent voices. He wore his usual navy blazer and red tie, projecting an image of authority. But behind his smile, I could see a flicker of discomfort. He wasn't used to this much scrutiny. The meeting began with routine business, budget reports, landscaping contracts, security updates. But the tension in the room was palpable, everyone waiting for the inevitable explosion. Finally, the floor opened for community comments. I rose slowly, holding a folder of documents under my arm. All eyes turned toward me. "Mr. Coleman," I began, my voice calm but firm. I'd like to address the recent violations and foreclosure threats directed at me, and I might add, several of my neighbors. Coleman's smile tightened. "Mr. Harrison, this is not the place for personal disputes. If you have an issue with your fines, you should take it up through the proper channels." Sick? I held up the red notice. Is this the proper channel? A seizure threat taped to my front door without due process? A murmur swept through the crowd. Several residents nodded. Others whispered angrily. Coleman's jaw tightened. Your violations are documented, sir. The board has every right. With respect, I interrupted, my tone sharpening. You and your board have a responsibility to enforce rules fairly, consistently, and lawfully. Yet what I see here is selective enforcement. Neighbors fined for basketball hoops, roof shingles, even hairline driveway cracks, while others are untouched. And now you're threatening foreclosure over fines that don't even hold up to inspection. The room erupted in murmurs and scattered applause. Coleman slammed his gavel on the table. Order? I will have order. I stepped closer to the table, my folder in hand. I have photographs of my property, time-stamped and dated, that prove your claims are false. I have testimonies from neighbors who've been harassed with baseless fines. And I have documentation showing that properties foreclosed under your watch have been quickly resold, often to companies connected to your personal associates. A gasp rippled through the room. Coleman's face reddened. You have no right. Because this isn't just about me. This is about an entire community being bullied and extorted by the very people sworn to protect its interests. Coleman's retaliation for a moment. Coleman looked rattled, but then he straightened, his voice dripping with disdain. And Mr. Rave. Harrison, I suggest you tread carefully. Making baseless accusations against this board could result in legal action against you. Perhaps you're unaware of the consequences of slander. I let a small smile play at the corner of my lips. On the contrary, Mr. Coleman, I'm very aware of the law. And I assure you, everything I've stated can be proven with evidence. Can you say the same for your violations against me? The silence that followed was deafening. Even his loyal board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Coleman tried to recover, waving his hand dismissively. This meeting is not a courtroom. We don't have time for theatrics. Then perhaps you should stop running this association like a dictatorship, I said evenly, because sooner or later the truth will end up in a courtroom. The crowd erupted in applause, louder this time. Coleman slammed his gavel again, his composure cracking. This meeting is adjourned, he barked, standing abruptly. Board members, follow me. He gathered his papers and stormed out, his entourage scrambling behind him. The room buzzed with energy, residents turning to one another with renewed courage. For the first time, someone had stood up to the HOA President and refused to be silenced. After the meeting, as people filed out, several neighbors approached me, their voices low but urgent. Thank you, Mrs. Hernandez whispered. We've been too scared to speak up. You gave us hope tonight. Mr. Williams clasped my shoulder. I've been waiting for someone to challenge him. Count me in if you're building a case. I nodded, grateful but cautious. Stay alert. They'll retaliate, but together we can stop this. When I finally stepped outside into the cool night air, I noticed Coleman standing near his car, speaking in hushed tones with another man. His eyes flicked toward me, narrowing with hostility. It was clear the confrontation had escalated the battle, and Coleman wasn't going to back down. The knock at midnight 2 nights later, I was sitting in my study reviewing case files when a knock echoed at my door. Glancing at the clock, I saw it was nearly midnight. Curious and wary, I walked to the front door. Through the peephole, I saw 2 men in dark suits. They carried clipboards and wore serious expressions. Who is it? I asked firmly. HOA enforcement, one replied. We need to inspect your property. At midnight, I said, my voice cold. You have no legal authority to demand entry, especially at this hour. Leave my property immediately. The man hesitated. If you don't comply, further action will be taken. I didn't flinch. And if you don't leave, I'll call the police and file charges for trespassing. Your choice. There was a pause. Then the men exchanged a look and retreated into the night. As I locked the door, I felt a surge of determination. Coleman was testing me with intimidation tactics. But I had faced far greater threats in my courtroom. This was nothing more than a bully rattling his saber, and I was prepared to push back harder. A community divided in the following weeks, the neighborhood began to fracture. Some residents rallied behind me, emboldened by my confrontation at the meeting. Others, fearful of retaliation, sided with Coleman or kept their heads down. Coleman's board issued new rules, including restrictions on gatherings and unauthorized communications about HOA matters. It was a blatant attempt to stifle dissent. But I knew such rules wouldn't hold up under legal scrutiny. Behind the scenes, I continued gathering evidence. I obtained public records of property transfers uncovering a disturbing trend. Multiple foreclosed homes had been purchased at suspiciously low prices by shell companies connected to Coleman's brother-in-law. The picture was becoming clear. Coleman wasn't just enforcing rules. He was running a racket, using fines and threats to seize homes, then funneling them into the hands of his associates for profit. The second showdown, the next HOA meeting, was even more crowded than the last. Word had spread that something big was happening, and residents packed the clubhouse to capacity. Coleman looked visibly tense as he called the meeting to order. This time, I didn't wait for community comments. I rose as soon as the budget discussion began. Mr. Coleman, I said loudly, holding up a stack of documents. I have here a record of property transfers showing multiple foreclosed homes sold to companies tied to your family. Care to explain this conflict of interest to the community? Gasps filled the room. Coleman's face flushed crimson. That information is irrelevant, he snapped. You had no right to obtain those records. They're public, I countered smoothly, and they show a clear pattern of abuse. You're exploiting your position for personal gain, and you're doing it at the expense of every homeowner here. The crowd erupted. Shouts, accusations, demands for answers. Coleman banged his gavel furiously, but the noise drowned him out. You think you're clever, Harrison, he shouted over the chaos, but you're nothing more than a troublemaker. This board will see to it that you pay for your insolence. I stepped closer, my gaze locked on his. Locked on his. Oh no, Mr. Coleman, the time for threats is over. The next time we meet, it won't be in this clubhouse. It'll be in a courtroom. And I promise you the law will not be on your side. The room exploded with cheers, the sound of neighbors finding their voice at last. Coleman stood frozen, his mask of control slipping as the weight of the moment settled in. The confrontation was no longer just between him and me. It was now a battle for the soul of the community, and the tide had begun to turn. The confrontation in the clubhouse had cracked the facade of the HOA. Coleman had tried to maintain his grip through intimidation and procedure, but his mask had slipped in front of the entire community. For the first time, the residents of our neighborhood had seen the possibility that their suffering wasn't just a bad lease or strict rule enforcement. Something darker was at play, but suspicion wasn't enough. If I was to dismantle this operation, I needed more than speeches and murmurs. I needed hard, undeniable proof. The paper trail, one thing I'd learned in my years on the bench, was that greed always left a paper trail. No matter how carefully concealed, the pursuit of money created cracks, suspicious transfers, unusual payments, or shell companies that didn't add up. I started with a county recorder's office, combing through property transaction records for the past 5 years. It was tedious work, but methodical digging was second nature to me. What I found confirmed my suspicions. Several homes in our neighborhood had indeed gone into foreclosure, not through banks, but directly through HOA action. The properties had then been sold at public auction, often at prices well below market value. But the buyers were not ordinary families or independent investors. Time and again, the winning bidder was a limited liability company, LLC, with bland names like Riverside Properties or Green Oak Holdings. At first glance, they looked unremarkable. But digging deeper, I discovered that many of these LLC were registered to the same address, a law office downtown that handled small incorporations. And when I cross-referenced the managing members, a familiar name popped up: Coleman's brother-in-law, operating through multiple layers of ownership to disguise his involvement. It was a classic scheme. Weaponize the HOA authority to levy fines, inflate them to astronomical amounts, and when homeowners couldn't pay, push them into foreclosure. Then swoop in through a controlled auction, purchase the home for pennies on the dollar, and either flip it or rent it out for profit. Coleman wasn't running a neighborhood association. He was running a real estate racket. Patterns of intimidation, the financial evidence alone was damning, but numbers on a page didn't capture the human cost. I began talking more openly with neighbors, listening to their stories. Mrs. Hernandez, the woman fined for her son's basketball hoop, admitted she had received threats about further consequences if she didn't stay quiet. Another family, the Newens, told me they had received late-night visits from inspectors who demanded entry to their backyard. When they refused, they were fined heavily for unauthorized alterations, even though nothing had been changed. Then there was Mr. Patel, an elderly man who had lived in the community for over 20 years. His voice trembled as he explained how he had nearly lost his home. "They fined me for weeds," he said quietly. "Weeds? I pay a gardener, but they still said my lawn was non-compliant. The fines grew so fast I couldn't keep up. I thought I would lose everything. Then one of Coleman's people came to me and said, 'If you sell now, you can walk away without shame.' I clenched my fists under the table. This wasn't governance. This wasn't governance. This was extortion." The Whisper Network, the deeper I dug, the more I realized Coleman relied not just on official notices, but also on a whisper network of fear. Residents would receive anonymous calls urging them to pay fines quietly. Others found cryptic notes slipped under their doors. It was psychological warfare designed to make people feel isolated and powerless. But my confrontation at the clubhouse had disrupted that narrative. People began approaching me in secret, slipping me documents, forwarding emails, even recording conversations. Slowly, a coalition was forming, not out of ambition, but out of desperation. One evening, I sat at my dining table surrounded by stacks of evidence, property records, financial transfers, witness statements. Each piece on its own told a small story. Together, they painted a picture of systemic abuse. And Coleman, whether through arrogance or carelessness, had left his fingerprints on nearly every part of it. The special assessment for Coleman's next move came in the form of a community-wide letter. It announced a special assessment of $5,000 per household, allegedly to cover illegal expenses and infrastructure improvements. Residents were furious. At the next board meeting, chaos erupted as people shouted their outrage. Coleman tried to maintain order, but his explanations were flimsy. "This is for the good of the community," he insisted, his voice rising above the din. "Without this assessment, we cannot maintain property values or fund necessary projects." I rose from my seat, holding the letter aloft.
Yet, I said clearly, there is no documentation of these expenses.
"No bids, no contracts, no invoices. Where is this money really going, Mr. Coleman?" All eyes turned to him. For a moment he faltered, his lips parting without words. Then he banged the gavel furiously. "We're undermining this association," he snapped. "If you don't like it, perhaps you should find another place to live." That was his mistake. The room exploded in boos and angry shouts. Even those who had once feared him now saw the truth. He wasn't protecting their homes. He was plundering them. The quiet threat later that night as I returned home, I found an envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence typed in bold letters, "Stop digging or you'll regret it." I read it under the glow of the street lamp, my jaw tightening. It wasn't the first threat I'd received in my career, and it wouldn't be the last. But the fact that Coleman, or his cronies, had resorted to anonymous intimidation meant one thing. I was getting too close. Instead of fear, I felt clarity. They were desperate, and desperation made people sloppy. Connecting the dots, the final piece of the puzzle came when I traced a wire transfer from one of the shell companies to Coleman's personal account. It wasn't huge, just under $20,000, but it was enough to prove financial gain. Combined with the testimonies, the property records, and the intimidation tactics, it created a chain of evidence that was impossible to ignore. This was no longer just a matter of HOA misconduct. This was fraud, abuse of power, and possibly racketeering. I knew what my next step had to be. Preparing for battle, I spent the following week assembling a comprehensive dossier. Every letter, every photo, every recorded conversation was meticulously organized. I wasn't planning to file it just yet. I wanted to make sure every stone was turned, every document in order. But I knew the day would come when this file would land on a prosecutor's desk. I outlined the charges: fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, intimidation, misuse of funds, conflict of interest. I cross-referenced each with supporting documents and testimony. It was meticulous, exhausting work. But with every page, I felt the case growing stronger. Coleman's growing desperation, meanwhile, Coleman was unraveling. was unraveling. He doubled down on fines, issuing violations for absurd things like a holiday decorations exceeding size limits or a curtains not conforming to community color schemes. But now, instead of cowering, residents laughed. They photographed their decorations, shared the letters online, and added them to our coalition's evidence archive. The more he pushed, the more he exposed himself. At one meeting, Coleman exploded when a resident openly asked where the special assessment money had gone. Quote, "Ha! Dare you question this board?" he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. The outburst was recorded on a smartphone and circulated through the neighborhood within hours. His authority, once unquestioned, was crumbling. The turning point, the final piece, fell into place when one of Coleman's own allies switched sides. Mr. Lewis, the board member who had warned me before, showed up at my door one evening. He looked tired, defeated. "I can't do this anymore," he said quietly. I joined the board to help the community, not to watch people lose their homes. Coleman promised us benefits, but it's gone too far. He handed me a manila folder. Inside were internal emails, meeting notes, and payment records. The documents detailed not only Coleman's involvement, but also the complicity of other board members. "This will end him," Lewis said simply. And he was right. Reflection gathering evidence was never about proving myself innocent of their bogus claims. That part had been obvious from the start. It was about exposing the larger truth, that behind every violation notice, every whispered threat, every foreclosure was a deliberate plan to exploit an entire community. By the time my evidence file was complete, I no longer felt like a homeowner under siege. I felt like a prosecutor preparing for trial. And Coleman, whether he realized it or not, was about to stand in the dock. The confrontation had been public. The hidden agenda had been revealed. Now, with evidence in hand, the real battle was ready to begin. The storm that Coleman had been brewing finally broke one morning in late spring. The day began innocuously enough. Birds chirped, sunlight filtered through the blinds, and the ordinary rhythms of suburban life played out. Kids biking to school, sprinklers watering lawns, dogs barking at delivery trucks. But in the pit of my stomach, I felt the heaviness of inevitability. Coleman's escalating hostility and the mounting evidence against him meant only one thing. He would strike before I could. And strike he did. The arrival at precisely 8:00 a.m., the rumble of engines shattered the calm. I stepped outside to find a convoy of vehicles lining my cul-de-sac. 2 HOA marked utility trucks, a rented moving van, and several black SUVs. From the largest vehicle stepped Coleman himself, dressed in a tailored suit far too extravagant for a neighborhood matter, flanked by 2 board members carrying clipboards. Behind them, a crew of uniformed contractors in reflective vests began unloading tools, dollies, and even plywood sheets meant for boarding windows. I recognized the tactic immediately. This wasn't just a notice of foreclosure or a lien filing. This was a show of brute force, an attempt to seize and occupy my home before the legal dust had even settled. Coleman smiled as he approached, though the smugness barely disguised the tension around his eyes. "A morning, Harrison," he called, loud enough for neighbors to hear. "I'm afraid you've left us no choice. By authority vested in the HOA, we're here to repossess this property for failure to comply with community bylaws." Mothers in bathrobes clutching coffee mugs, retirees leaning on canes, teenagers filming with smartphones. Half the neighborhood was watching. Coleman, clearly relishing the spectacle, turned toward them with a raised voice. "Let this serve as a reminder. Our community has rules. Those who refuse to follow them will face the consequences." His tone dripped with self-righteousness, but beneath it, I could hear the desperate edge of a man whose empire was beginning to crumble. I took a slow breath, steadying my heartbeat. This was the first standoff of Coleman, I said evenly, stepping off my porch. "You and I both know you don't have the authority to repossess anyone's home. HOA boards enforce maintenance standards, not property seizures. What you're doing is illegal," he smirked. "Illegal?" he smirked. "No, Harrison. What's illegal is your repeated violations. Safety hazards, unapproved modifications, delinquent dues. We followed procedure. Today, this property is being secured for reassignment." One of the contractors moved toward my garage with a crowbar. "Secure the premises," Coleman barked. "Stop right there," I commanded, my voice echoing with a force that froze the man mid-step. "Take one more move toward my home, and you'll be personally liable for trespassing and destruction of property." The contractor looked from me to Coleman, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The crowd murmured. For the first time, doubt rippled through the facade of authority Coleman had built. Producing the evidence, I walked calmly back inside and returned with the thick binder, the culmination of months of investigation, neatly tabbed and organized. Holding it up, I faced the onlookers. "This," I declared, "is a complete record of every fraudulent action taken by this board over the past 2 years. False violation notices, financial misappropriations, evidence of intimidation and abuse of power. Every detail is documented, signed, and supported by testimony." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones angled toward me, recording every word. Coleman's face flushed crimson. "That's nonsense," he snapped, baseless accusations from a disgruntled homeowner, but his voice cracked under the weight of his own. "You see, Coleman," I said slowly, letting the silence build, "you chose the wrong person to target. You assumed I was just another resident you could bully. What you failed to realize is that I am a sitting federal judge, sworn to uphold the law of this country. And I have the power and the evidence to ensure every single one of your crimes is exposed in a court of law." For a moment, the street went dead silent. Even the birds seemed to stop. Then, as the words sank in, the crowd erupted. Gasps, whispers, and outright shouts filled the air. Several neighbors applauded. A teenager yelled a "busted" while recording Coleman's stunned expression. Coleman froze in place, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The color drained from his face. He stammered, You can't. But his confidence had evaporated. He looked less like a leader and more like a cornered criminal. Coleman's collapsed, one of his board allies tugged at his sleeve. "James, maybe we should go. This doesn't look good." Coleman rounded on him, spittle flying. "Don't you dare back out now. We've come too far." But the contractors, sensing the tide had turned, began backing toward their trucks. Without their muscle, Coleman's grand display looked pitiful. A desperate man with a clipboard trying to command authority he no longer possessed. The residents, emboldened, stepped closer. "Mrs. Hernandez shouted, "We're not afraid of you anymore." Mr. Patel raised his cane defiantly. The Newans stood shoulder to shoulder, recording every second. Coleman was no longer in control. The police arrived just when the scene reached its breaking point. 2 police cruisers rolled into the cul-de-sac, lights flashing. Officers stepped out, surveying the standoff. One approached me first. Sir, we received reports of a disturbance," he said cautiously. "What's going on here?" I handed him the binder. "Officer, this is an attempted illegal seizure of private property. These individuals are acting without lawful authority. Everything is documented in this file." The officer flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. Then he turned to Coleman. "Do you have a court order authorizing this action?" Coleman sputtered. We're the HOA. We don't need..." Yes, you do," the officer cut him off firmly. "A property seizures require judicial approval. You have no authority here." The walk of shame, the officers ordered Coleman and his entourage to stand down immediately. Contractors packed up their tools in silence, avoiding eye contact. Residents jeered and clapped as the convoy slowly retreated down the street. Coleman, once the untouchable ruler of the HOA, now looked like a defeated tyrant. His shoulders sagged, his eyes darted nervously toward the cameras recording his humiliation. As he climbed into his SUV, I called out one final statement. "This isn't over, Coleman. The next time we meet, it will be in federal court." The cheer that erupted from the crowd was deafening. Reflection that day wasn't just about saving my home. It was about breaking the spell of fear that Coleman had cast over the entire neighborhood. His attempted seizure, meant to intimidate, had instead exposed his corruption for all to see. And while the battle was far from over, the momentum had shifted permanently. For the first time, the community believed not just in me, but in themselves. They realized that no one, not even the self-proclaimed king of the HOA, was above the law. And Coleman. His empire was already collapsing. The day of reckoning arrived on a crisp autumn morning. The courthouse stood like a fortress of stone and steel, its columns towering against the pale sky. For months I had prepared for this moment. Every late night at my dining room, a war room, every affidavit, every recording, it had all been leading here. Coleman had tried to strip me of my home. Now he stood accused of stripping dozens of families of theirs. Fraud, intimidation, embezzlement, abuse of power, charges stacked like bricks on a wall he could no longer climb. The courtroom buzzed with energy as residents filed into the gallery. Some clutched folders of evidence, others simply wanted to see justice. The same neighbors who once whispered in fear now sat proudly, united, ready to face the man who had tormented them. At the defense table, Coleman sat flanked by two attorneys, his suit impeccable but his face pale. He avoided eye contact with the crowd, his once smug expression replaced with grim resolve. I sat opposite him with the state prosecutor, a woman whose reputation for dismantling white-collar crime was legendary. I had handed her the case file weeks earlier, and she had built it into a fortress of prosecution. When the judge entered and the bailiff called the court to order, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Opening statements, the prosecutor rose first. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice calm but sharp. This case is about betrayal. The defendant, James Coleman, was entrusted with the stewardship of his community as president of the Homeowners Association. Instead of protecting his neighbors, he preyed upon them. He used fear, lies, and fabricated violations to force hardworking families into foreclosure, funneling their homes into the hands of his associates for profit. Over the next days, we will show you documents, recordings, and testimony that prove beyond doubt James Coleman turned a position of trust into a criminal enterprise. The words landed heavy. The jury leaned forward. The residents nodded, some whispering in agreement. Then Coleman's attorney rose, smoothing his tie. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a misunderstanding. My client, Mr. Coleman, acted in good faith to uphold community standards. Were mistakes made? Perhaps. But fraud? Conspiracy? These are wild accusations from disgruntled homeowners unhappy about rules they agreed to follow. The prosecution wants to paint Mr. Coleman as a villain, but the truth is simpler. He was doing his job." Coleman nodded vigorously, as if trying to convince himself as much as the jury. The evidence unfolds. The prosecution wasted no time. The first witnesses were residents. Mrs. Hernandez, Mr. Patel, the Newens. Each told their story under oath, how they were fined for trivial or fabricated violations, how threats escalated when they resisted, how they were pressured to sell. Their voices cracked with emotion, but their words carried power. The jury watched their faces, saw their sincerity, and felt their pain. Then came the documents. Violation letters with identical language, all signed by Coleman. Bank statements tracing money from foreclosed homes into shell accounts. Emails where board members joked about bleeding them dry. The recordings followed. One clip captured a midnight inspection on my property. Another caught a board member admitting Coleman had arrangements to ensure compliance. The pied de résistance was Coleman himself screaming at a resident during a meeting, his voice dripping with arrogance as he declared, "How you have no choice but to obey this board." Played in court, the audio silenced even his own attorneys. My turn on the stand. When my name was called, the room grew quiet. I took the oath, then sat tall in the witness chair. The prosecutor guided me through the months of intimidation, the investigative steps I took, and the evidence I compiled. I spoke clearly, methodically, just as I would when addressing a courtroom in my professional role. "Mr. Harrison," she asked at one point, "why did you document all of this so carefully?" Because I recognized early on that what was happening wasn't simply poor management, I replied. It was systemic abuse, and as both a homeowner and a federal judge, I couldn't stand by while my neighbors were exploited. I knew the truth had to be proven beyond doubt, not just suspected. Gasps fluttered through the gallery. Coleman's eyes widened. The jury scribbled notes furiously. The defense attorney attempted to rattle me on cross-examination. "You claim to be impartial," he sneered, "yet you have a personal vendetta against my client. Isn't it true you gathered this evidence to protect your own property?" I met his gaze calmly. Protecting my home was the beginning. Protecting my community became the purpose, and holding your client accountable is justice. Even the judge looked impressed. Coleman on the stand. When Coleman finally took the stand, The courtroom seemed to pulse with anticipation. His attorneys had clearly prepped him, but nerves betrayed him. Mr. Coleman, the prosecutor began. Do you deny authorizing these violation notices? He adjusted his tie. I was simply enforcing bylaws. Do you deny transferring foreclosed properties to shell companies connected to your associates? That's business strategy. Perfectly legal. Yan intimidating residents, telling them they would regret challenging you? His jaw tightened. I don't recall. The prosecutor leaned closer, voice steady. Then allow me to refresh your memory. She played the recording of Mr. Lewis admitting Coleman's arrangements. Coleman's face drained of color. One by one, his lies unraveled. Each document contradicted his claims. Each testimony painted him as the manipulative tyrant he truly was. His arrogance crumbled into stammers, his confidence into sweat. By the time cross-examination ended, Coleman looked less like a leader and more like a man watching his empire collapse in real time. Closing arguments. The prosecutor's closing was a masterstroke. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a community betrayed. James Coleman thought he was untouchable. He thought fear would silence his neighbors. He thought no one would challenge him. But courage is contagious. One by one, the people you've heard from today chose to stand up, and together their voices reveal the truth. James Coleman is guilty of exploiting his neighbors for profit. We ask you to return a verdict that restores justice. The defense tried to salvage what it could, pleading for sympathy, suggesting Coleman was overzealous but not criminal. But the words rang hollow after weeks of damning evidence. The verdict deliberations were brief. Less than 3 hours later, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, holding the slip of paper. On the charge of fraud, guilty. On the charge of embezzlement, guilty. On the charge of intimidation, guilty. On the charge of abuse of power, guilty. Each word landed like a hammer blow. The gallery erupted in tears, cheers, even applause before the judge banged his gavel for order. Coleman slumped in his chair, face ashen, his empire shattered. The judge's voice rang out, James Coleman, you are hereby remanded into custody pending sentencing. This court will not tolerate exploitation masquerading as leadership. 2 deputies stepped forward, handcuffing him as cameras flashed. The once untouchable HOA President was led away like any other criminal. Aftermath, the neighborhood transformed in the weeks that followed. A new board was elected, transparent and accountable. Fines were reviewed, wrongful foreclosures challenged, and stolen funds began the process of restitution. Neighbors who once barely nodded in passing now gathered for block parties, celebrating their newfound unity. Fear had been replaced with solidarity. For me, the trial was both victory and burden. I had protected my home, yes, but more importantly, I had safeguarded justice for dozens of families. I hadn't sought the fight, but when it came, I had stood firm, and together we had prevailed. Reflection in the end, Coleman's downfall wasn't just about laws or evidence. It was about people reclaiming their dignity. It was about a community remembering that power comes not from titles or threats, but from courage and truth. And as I walked through my neighborhood on a quiet evening, children playing, neighbors waving, I felt a deep peace. Justice had been served, order restored. Coleman had tried to seize my home. Instead, he lost everything. The echoes of the gavel from Coleman's sentencing day lingered in my memory long after the trial ended. But unlike the sharp sting of injustice that had haunted our community for so long, this sound carried something different. It was closure. The freedom. It was the beginning of something new. The man who once strutted through our streets like a king had been stripped of his crown. His empire of intimidation collapsed in a courtroom under the weight of truth. And as deputies led him away in handcuffs, the people he had terrorized stood taller, prouder, no longer bound by fear. But the story didn't end there. What came next was perhaps even more remarkable. The rebuilding of trust, the renewal of community, and the quiet but powerful reminder that when ordinary people stand together, even the most corrupt tyrants can fall. Rebuilding the HOA, the first order of business, was restructuring the Homeowners Association itself. After Coleman's conviction, several board members resigned in disgrace, their complicity too obvious to ignore. Others tried to cling to power, but the residents had had enough. We held a community-wide election in the high school gymnasium, a place symbolic of fairness and openness. For the first time in years, attendance was overwhelming. Neighbors who had once avoided HOA meetings for fear of retaliation now packed the room, their voices eager to be heard. Instead of secrecy and intimidation, transparency became our guiding principle. The new board was composed of residents who had been victims themselves, Mrs. Hernandez, Mr. Patel, and even the new ones. These are people who understood firsthand the importance of fairness, empathy, and accountability. We implemented reforms immediately. Open financial records were published online for everyone to see. Bylaw enforcement became consistent and reasonable, focused on genuine safety and maintenance rather than pettiness. A grievance process allowed homeowners to challenge decisions without fear of retribution. Term limits were established to prevent any one person from consolidating power the way Coleman had. It was the birth of a new HOA that truly served, not ruled. The neighbors' transformation, perhaps the most profound change, wasn't structural but emotional. For years, the neighborhood had been a place of silent dread. People avoided eye contact, kept their blinds drawn, whispered warnings to one another. Now, the energy was different. Children played freely on lawns without parents worrying about noise violations. Families hung decorations for holidays without fear of fines. Neighbors lingered on sidewalks, chatting about weekend plans instead of the latest threats from Coleman. Fear had been replaced with friendship. One evening, weeks after the trial, I walked past Mr. Patel's house. He was in the yard, tending to his roses. When he saw me, his face lit up. "Up, Judge Harrison," he called warmly. "Come, look at these blooms. Haven't been fined once for them this season." He laughed, the sound free of bitterness for the first time in years. Moments like that told me justice hadn't just punished Coleman. It had healed us. Reflection as a judge, as a federal judge, I had presided over countless cases. I had seen greed, corruption, and abuse of power. But experiencing it firsthand, in my own neighborhood, on my own doorstep, was different. It reminded me that justice isn't some lofty principle confined to courtrooms. It's something lived, something felt. Coleman's downfall was a professional validation of everything I believed in, but it was also deeply personal. It reminded me that the law is not just about statutes and procedures. It is about protecting the dignity of ordinary people. When I stood in my courtroom, gavel in hand, I often told jurors, justice isn't abstract. It lives in our communities. Now I understood that truth in ways I never had before. The broader ripple word of Coleman's conviction spread beyond our subdivision. Newspapers picked up the story. HOA President found guilty of fraud and intimidation. Other communities reached out asking how we had done it, how they too could hold corrupt boards accountable. Emails poured in from across the state. Some were from victims of similar abuse, others from reform advocates, even a few from state lawmakers considering legislation to place stricter oversight on AHs. Our small neighborhood battle had become a symbol, a reminder that no matter how localized corruption feels, it connects to a larger struggle for fairness everywhere. Personal healing, yet victory came with its own weight. For months, I had lived on adrenaline, always preparing for the next move, the next violation, the next confrontation. When it was finally over, I felt the exhaustion settle in. There were nights when I'd wake up, convinced I heard footsteps on my lawn, only to realize the cameras were silent and the yard was safe. Years of tension don't dissolve overnight, but slowly, peace returned. I started reading on my porch again, no longer scanning the street for HOA patrols. I planted a new garden bed, one Coleman surely would have fined me for, and smiled when neighbors complimented the flowers. Life, once dominated by conflict, regained its simple joys. A community reborn, the neighborhood we built after Coleman wasn't perfect, but it was alive again. We organized block parties, barbecues, even a summer fair with booths and games for kids. Instead of HOA letters filled with threats, we received newsletters filled with community updates, recipes, and congratulations for birthdays and graduations. Trust had returned, and with it, pride. One evening, as I walked home from a community gathering, Mrs. Hernandez stopped me. Her eyes shimmered as she said, "You didn't just save your home, Judge. You saved all of us." Her words stayed with me. I hadn't sought to be a hero. I had only wanted fairness. But perhaps that's what real leadership is, not seeking power, but defending those who have none. Legacy years later, when I reflect on that turbulent chapter of my life, I don't think first of Coleman's arrogance or even his downfall. I think of the courage of ordinary people. The way neighbors who once feared fines found their voices. The way we turned fear into unity and unity into justice. Coleman's name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power is abused. But our community became something else, a model of resilience, of how ordinary people can stand up against extraordinary corruption. And every time I walk through those quiet, tree-lined streets hearing laughter echo from porches, I know one thing for certain. Coleman may have tried to seize my home, but in the end, he gave us something greater. He gave us back our community. Final reflection: justice is not about titles. It is not about gavels or robes or courtrooms. Justice lives in the courage to say enough when wrongs are done. That is the true legacy of our story, and it will live long after Coleman's name is forgotten.